Well, good morning or afternoon, whenever it is that you're going to be listening to this. Our Bible study today is actually just dealing with a particular Bible story in the Old Testament, but I thought I'd do a song that tells Bible stories perhaps in ways you've never heard before. So it's called the Baptist Sunday School song. So there's a chorus to it, so you can learn it. It's real simple. You can sing along with me. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. Yep, that's it. Earth was built in 6 days and finished on the 7th. According to the contract, it should have been the 11th. The painters wouldn't paint and the workers wouldn't work. So God turned around and filled it up with dirt. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. Adam was the first man and Eve was the spouse. They got together and they started keeping house. Everything was calm and quiet on the main, till they had a little boy and they started raising Cain. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. Daniel was a naughty boy who wouldn't obey the king. The king said, "Man, we won't stand for any such a thing." So they threw him in a pit with lions underneath. But Daniel was a dentist and he pulled the lion's teeth. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. That's not all. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king said, "Bow down," but they said, "No go." So they threw him in a furnace that was hotter than anything. But with asbestos underwear, they didn't feel a thing. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. Jonah was a sailor who sought to set sail. He tried to book the passage on a transatlantic whale. The whale's accommodations weren't comfortable at best. So Jonah pushed the button and the rail did the rest. Young folks, old folks, everybody come. Join the Baptist Sunday School and have a lot of fun. Please check your chewing gum and erasers at the door, and you hear some Bible stories that you never heard before. Well, I'm sure you've never heard a song like that before. And of course, I'm sure that you've never heard Bible stories like that before. Some of my favorite Bible stories, and it's really a good thing just to get to know the stories of the Bible. The stories of the Bible are the foundation for to understand things that are happening later down the road, to understand the character of God, to learn perhaps the expectations that God has for us. But more than that, the stories help us to see how God is going to be true to His Word. That is, He'll say something here, He'll make a promise here, and we get to see it unfold and come true a little bit later over there. Now, some of the remarkable stories about this is He'll make a promise to certain people, and those people actually don't fully realize the benefit of those promises, but they still act in accordance to them, knowing that at some point in the future they are going to experience those promises. One of my favorite stories has to do with Joseph. Now, Joseph is one of the great-grandsons of Abraham, and to really understand this story, we need to go all the way back to Abraham, and this is actually about 400 years before the event of Joseph's story unfolds, or very close to that. In the 15th chapter of Genesis, God makes a covenant with Abraham. And we read about that in the 15th chapter, and it's kind of a weird thing because God instructs Abraham, and yes, God spoke directly to Abraham. And he gave him these instructions. He was to take certain animals and divide them in half and split them up into two separate piles, and this became a blood covenant, and the tradition was that both parties who were making a covenant would walk between these sacrifices and in effect say, if either one of us breaks this covenant, our lives would be forfeited like these sacrifices that were being made, a bull, birds, other sacrifices, and this happens to Abraham. Now, it was during this time that we read that he was called Abram before God changed his name, and he was confirming a covenant. Starting in the first verse of Genesis 15, it says, "And after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram, in a vision, saying, Fear not, Abram, I am thy shield and thy exceeding great reward. And Abram said, Lord God, what wilt thou give me, seeing I go childless, and the steward of my house is this Eliezer of Damascus? And Abram said, Behold, to me thou hast given no seed," that is, no progeny, no children. "And lo, one born in my house is going to be mine heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This shall not be thine heir, but he that shall come forth from thine own bowels," that is, your own innards, your own body, "shall be thine heir. And he brought forth abroad and said, Look now towards the heaven and tell the stars," or look at the stars, "and see if you can count the number of them. And he said unto Abraham, he said, So shall thy seed be," the vastness of the numbers of stars. "And he," Abram, "believed the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness." Now, in order to fulfill this covenant, this promise, God says, do this sacrificial thing. And then he goes on to say that this seed that I'm telling you about is going to be, well, here it is in the 12th verse. "And when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and lo, a horror of great darkness fell upon him." That's just a darkness that is just so heavy, you almost can cut it with a knife. And I don't know if you've ever been in a cave where they've actually turned out the lights, but the darkness is just, it's just overwhelming. It feels like a weight. "And he said to Abram, Know of a surety," be assured of this, "that thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they," those people, "shall afflict that seed for 400 years, and also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge, and afterwards shall they come out and be of great substance," or be with great substance. That is, they're going to have a lot of possessions. "And thou shalt go to thy fathers in peace, and thou shalt be buried in a good old age. And then he says something here very interesting in the verse 16. But in the fourth generation they shall come hither, they will come out again, for the iniquities of the Amorites is not yet full. See, God had already promised Abram, who was to become Abraham, the land of the Canaanite, the land that we know as Israel today. And God was saying to Abram, guess what? You're going to have the seed come from you, and they will be slaves in a foreign country. It happened to be Egypt. And in the fourth generation, some 400 years after this particular place in the Bible, the 15th chapter of Genesis, and the time that the nation of Israel is at Mount Sinai and receiving the law is right about 400 years. But God says they're doing this because the iniquity, the sin, the rebellion of the Amorites, that's one of the tribes of the land that they were going to overtake, was not yet full. Very, very curious about that, because that tells us that there's something else going on in the land of Canaan that God is dealing with in terms of rebellion against him. Well, time goes on. Abram, who is still in the land of Canaan right now, he has a son. When he's 100 years old, and his wife Sarah was 90 years old, and that was a miracle by itself. And there's lots more to that story, but Sarah dies, Abraham gets old, and Isaac has his own son. He has two sons, Jacob and Esau. And God chooses Jacob as part of this seed to build this nation. And Jacob has two wives, two concubines, and out of these four women create at least 12 brothers. And these brothers grow up to become the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, there's a whole slew of things going on there, and some of you already know the story about Joseph, and Joseph was second to the youngest of these 12 brothers, and he happened to be the favorite of his father Jacob. And we know how favoritism happens in many families, even in good families, or seems to anyway. And that caused friction. It caused so much friction that these brothers conspired, because they were all so much older than Joseph, to either kill him, because Joseph seemed to be insufferable in his boasts and in taking the good life that they thought maybe perhaps was supposed to be theirs, and those privileges, and so on and so forth. Whatever it is, they were jealous, and jealousy was so great that they conspired to kill him. And the oldest brother, Judah, and Reuben said, no, let's not kill him. Let's just kidnap him and take the beautiful coat that his dad had made for him and kill a wild animal and put blood on it and bring it back to Dad and say that blood is Joseph's and that he is dead. But in the meantime, they sell Joseph to some Ishmaelites, Bedouin people, who took him down to Egypt and sold him off into Egypt. And Joseph became a slave in Egypt. Now, the part of that story that becomes interesting is that none of this was anything that Joseph designed for his own life. I mean, we like to plan our lives and plan them right down to the very minute, perhaps. We want to choose our own destinies. We want to choose whom we are going to marry. We want to choose our our careers and the jobs, and we want to choose the school that we're going to. We like that freedom. We enjoy that. But here is a young man, perhaps he was about 16 or so, who was, through no fault of his own, sold into slavery by his own brothers. He was betrayed by his own family. But he didn't wallow in that, and he didn't rebel against that, which is a very interesting thing by itself. But the thing about it is, the story of Joseph, to make a long story shorter, is that he goes from being a slave to the prime minister because of his trustworthiness. And as a result of him becoming a prime minister, or the prime minister, second only to the king, the Pharaoh of Egypt, he had predicted through dreams, had given a prediction to the Pharaoh about 7 years of famine and 7 years of plenty. And so the Pharaoh put him in charge of preparing for those 7 years of famine and drought and time when crops wouldn't be growing. And Joseph did exactly that. And God used Joseph to save a nation. But more than that, in the land of Canaan, because the drought and the famine had hit that area of the land as well, the whole story goes that eventually all those brothers go down to Egypt to buy grain. But by this time, Joseph had grown up, and he was unrecognizable. They didn't recognize that their brother that they sold into slavery was actually the prime minister, as it were, second in command of all of Egypt. They had heard of the bounty that Egypt had been able to save up over the land, the time of plenty. And now that the famine had struck the entire region, they found that they needed to go and buy some food. And that's exactly what they did. Joseph recognized his brothers. And he goes through a very interesting rigmarole of trying to bring his brothers, playing a little game with them. I'm not sure exactly what the point of the game was, but the upshot is that eventually these brothers recognize, Joseph reveals to them that he is their brother Joseph. And of course, when that happened, they were in a moment of great dread. Here is the most powerful dude in all of Egypt, and they were in his hands. Joseph made a very interesting statement. He said to his brothers, "Don't be afraid." And this is after a whole lot of stuff happened. You have to go read the story in the latter part of the book of Genesis to find out what all went on. But Joseph made a very interesting statement. He says, "What you meant for harm, God intended for good." Even the shenanigans of the brothers selling their baby brother into slavery, God was able to take that and use it on a number of different levels. One was to fulfill his promise to Abram, that is his prophecy, because the sin of the land of the Canaanites was growing daily, and God was dealing with that and had a plan for it, which included really their ultimate destruction. But it wasn't until they absolutely and definitely deserved that it happened. But God used that event to not only save the family of Abraham, but to grow a nation. Because even while Abram was in the land of Canaan, and so was Isaac, and so was Jacob, and those 12 brothers and their families, they were still not truly landowners. They were Bedouin, they were travelers, they moved from place to place, just waiting for that time when God will fulfill his promise of giving them that land. Well, Joseph makes this statement to his brothers and saying, what you meant for bad, what you meant for harm, God meant for benefit, for his good, for our good. Well, that's a rather interesting conclusion. And to be able to see that in the middle of everything that's going on was extraordinary. Now we look at that and we look back upon that story, and a couple of things we recognize. One is Abraham never got to see all of that. The land was promised to Abraham, but Abraham never saw the land being given to him. The multitude of that would come from his loins, the only one he ever got to see was his son Isaac, and he had another son, Ishmael, and then he remarried after Sarah died, and he had 12 other sons from a wife named Keturah. That's 14 boys out of Abraham directly. All those other sons became what we know today as the Arab states, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq, Iran, that area. And those are populated by people from Abraham, oddly enough, kinfolk to Israel, which kind of affects that region even today. And that's kind of a marvelous thing to try and figure out. But the thing about it is, when we look back and read this story, we have the benefit of seeing God's hand at work in a very meticulous way, fulfilling every aspect of his promise to Abraham. Now, there are promises to Abraham that have not been fully fulfilled. And what we see from God fulfilling aspects of that promise, we are encouraged with great faith that God is going to fulfill the rest of it sometime in the future. We'll get to be able to see how that unfolds even. But the thing about these old Bible stories, we get to look back and see how God's hand worked in history and how marvelous everything was knit together in each of the events, knowing that even the players of those events, they weren't all righteous do-gooders. They had their own faults, but God was able to use them. And God is able to use you. And you can have the same faith that Abraham existed in knowing that God is going to take care of your life and give you a purpose. And whenever you encounter very difficult times, and some of you already live in very difficult times, but as a child of God, you have the unique position of allowing the Creator of the universe to work His goodness in and through you in spite of the hardship, the tough times, the bad decisions, decisions that were made that were beyond your control. God is going to be able to use all of that for your good and for His glory. And that we can be thankful for. When we read the stories of the Old Testament, we get to see and read about how God kept His word. And because of the truthfulness of all of those, we have every reason to believe that God will keep His word to us. Those of us who put our faith in the Lord Jesus Christ, His Son, for our salvation, God is faithful to fulfill the promise of our salvation. No matter what the circumstances of your life, God is able. I pray that you will read with eagerness these old Bible stories and appropriate for yourself that same faith that will bring you to a great understanding of how God can and does work in human life. Thank you.